This video is brought to you by Squarespace. Hi, I'm Andrew from Parlogram, and in this video, using my 1966 scrapbooks, I'm going to tell the story of how the Beatles went from this to this. On December the 16th, 1965, the music of Lennon and McCartney is broadcast on British television. It comes at the end of what had been their busiest year, and just 2 weeks after the release of Rubber Soul. The programme is built around songs they've written, which other artists have already recorded, and are now performing, or should I say miming. John and Paul appear in between each song to introduce it.
I couldn't possibly do a show without the wonderful and talented Thingy.
And join George and Ringo to perform both sides of their current single, Day Tripper, We Can Work It Out. It's an entertaining 45-minute show, but it feels formulaic and over-rehearsed, and John and Paul come across almost like extras in their own show.
And here she is, Miss Esther Phillips.
When they do appear, they don't seem to be putting much into it. In fact, they both look a bit bored at times.
What's all this, John? It's pizza salad.
It feels less like something they want to be doing and more like something they're expected to do. And that's how it had always worked. You write the song, you record it, and then you play it either on stage, on TV, or both. It's a cycle they seem to be getting tired of.
1966.
As 1966 begins, everything seems normal. The Beatles are at number 1 in both the album and the singles chart. But by the end of January, things go quiet, and Beatlemania, at least on the surface, goes into hibernation. There is one brief return to CTS Studios on January the 5th to overdub parts for the Beatles at Shea Stadium film for television, but even that is looking backwards, not forwards. In the United States, though, on February the 21st, Nowhere Man is released as a single, backed with What Goes On. Both tracks have been left off the Capitol version of Rubber Soul, so to American fans it feels like nothing has really changed. But the Beatles themselves had already moved on. On January the 12th, John, Cynthia, Ringo and Maureen fly out to Trinidad for a 10-day winter break. George marries Pattie Boyd on January the 21st, and 18 days later heads to Barbados for their honeymoon. Paul stays in London, where he meets Stevie Wonder for the first time. And for the first time in years, they're not reacting to demand, they're stepping away from it. And that's where the press start looking for something to report. In fact, they end up reporting that there's nothing to report. The music paper Disc, for example, runs a piece on February the 19th with the headline, Beatles, no new single planned yet. The group are described as still being on a break, with no clear idea of what comes next. And when you look at that cutting, you can feel the impatience. It's trying to pin down exactly what they're doing at a point where they're clearly stepping back. John says he has no clue what the next single will be, and that they won't really think about it until they're told it's time to record. That's not how things had worked before. Up to this point, there'd been a clear cycle. You write, you record, you release, you tour, then you do it again. So when there's suddenly no next step, it stands out. If you look a little closer at that same piece, there's another detail that stands out. Ringo talks about how they're spending their time. Getting up in the afternoon, moving between houses, using tape recorders and playing about with ideas. That line is easy to miss, but it tells you something. They're not doing nothing, they're just not working in the usual way. There's no schedule or deadline, but they are experimenting. At the same time, the public image doesn't really change. You see it in the holiday photographs. John and Ringo away with their wives in the Caribbean, relaxed and removed from the usual routine. There's even details about the beard Ringo grew on holiday, which he's careful to explain isn't permanent, and that it'll come off when they start work again. It sounds trivial, but it does tell you something. It feels like a pause, not an end. You also see it in the coverage of their homes and private lives. Ringo moving out to Surrey, trying to get away from the pressure of fans. It's presented as lifestyle, but there's more to it than that. They're starting to move away from the way they've been living.
Coo, what funny-looking flowers. Look out! Those are man-eating plants. Don't feel hurt, Ringo. Perhaps they just aren't hungry.
Oh, but we are. And here comes some food for thought.
If you're working on something that needs a proper home online, whether it's a collection, research, or a project like this, Squarespace makes it straightforward to build something that looks clean, professional, and that works properly. Everything is done in one place, so you're not having to piece together hosting, design, and analytics separately. You can organize material in a way that makes sense. If you're cataloging records, you can structure it by year, label, or pressing. If you're writing or publishing, everything you need is already built in. One feature that's particularly useful is Blueprint AI. You answer a few simple questions about what you're trying to create, and it builds a clean, well-structured site for you to start from. From there, you can adjust it as much or as little as you like. It also works well for media. You can embed video, create member areas, or even sell content if that's part of what you're doing. So if you've been thinking of setting something up, head on over to squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Parlogram to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. On March the 1st at 8 p.m. on BBC One, the Beatles at Shea Stadium is shown on British television for the first time. The coverage in the newspapers that day says a lot. It talks about 60,000 screaming, crying teenagers, almost as if the audience is the main event. This is still the dominant image of the Beatles, a live act playing to huge crowds. The focus is really on the scale, the excitement, and the atmosphere. But if you read the reviews carefully, there's also a note of reservation. One describes it as falling slightly short of what it could have been, and that musically it's not the Beatles at their best. And that's the key point. Around the same time, you also start to see a different kind of reaction from fans. This letter here describes them as masters of their craft, pointing out how far they've moved on from the earlier Yeah 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 phase into something more varied on Rubber Soul. That's fair enough, but it's still thinking about the songs in the same way, as things you write, record, and then perform. It doesn't really reflect what's starting to change. The idea that the studio itself is becoming part of the process hasn't quite registered yet, and you can see that expectation in the press as well. This report from early March confidently announces that a British tour is on, along with dates in Germany, Japan, and the United States. Some of that turns out to be true, but the British tour never happens, and that says a lot. Even at this point, the assumption is the cycle will simply start again. They'll go back out, play the shows, and carry on as before. Then you have something else entirely, the closure of the Cavern Club in Liverpool, the place where it all started. Newspaper reports describe fans refusing to leave, holding on to something they can see slipping away. At the time, it was just another news story, but in this context, it feels like the end of an era. On March the 25th, they take part in a photo session with Robert Whittaker that results in the infamous Butcher cover. It looks shocking even now. At the time, it must have been completely baffling. But it wasn't just done for effect. It was a comment on how they were being seen, idolised, almost dehumanised. On the surface, it's just another set of promotional images. But the tone is very different. Deliberately strange, slightly unsettling, and clearly not trying to fit the usual idea of how the Beatles should be presented. So even in something as routine as a photo shoot, you can see the shift starting to show. At the same time, George is studying the sitar and taking Indian music seriously. It's treated as more a curiosity, something a bit different, not really seen as that important. But it's one of the few things in that period that actually points forward. Paul is looking outwards, talking about other artists and where things might be heading. In this interview, he's reflecting on the wider scene, mentioning groups like The Who and Donovan, and admitting that no one really knows what's coming next. He's clearly aware that things are shifting, but it's still framed in terms of the wider scene, not in terms of what the Beatles themselves are about to do. So there isn't one clear direction emerging, just a series of small shifts all happening at the same time. On the surface, everything still looks familiar. There are singles being released in some countries and the usual television and press coverage. But underneath that, things are less clear. There's no studio activity, no clear project, and no obvious direction. And for fans, that's confusing. There are signs of activity, but they don't connect in the usual way. And that's what makes this period so interesting. Because there isn't a transition that's being announced or explained, it's just happening in the background. By the time they return to Abbey Road in April, something has already shifted. Not in a way that's being talked about or explained, but in how they're approaching the work itself. There's nothing in the press that points to it directly, and nothing in what they're doing publicly. But when they begin work on Tomorrow Never Knows on April the 6th, the difference is immediate. It doesn't start the way their songs usually do. It sits on a single chord with a constant drone underneath. And more than that, it's completely removed from the way they'd worked up to that point. Before, you wrote a song, you arranged it, and you recorded it. Here, the recording is the song, and it isn't something you could take on stage. It exists in the studio, and that changes everything. Tape loops, sound effects, ideas being shaped as the recording goes on. The studio isn't just capturing the song anymore, it's part of how the song is made. And once you hear it like that, everything that came before starts to look different. The break at the start of the year, the lack of a new single, the sense that they've stepped away from the usual cycle, all starts to make sense. So this doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes out of those early months of 1966, a period where on the surface very little seems to happen, but underneath something has already changed. We'll be looking at those changes in another video as we move through the 60th anniversary of this incredible period, so make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it. I'll be back very soon with more stories about the Beatles and the incredible music of the 1960s. But that's all for this one, so I'll say bye for now and thanks for watching.